Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Mid-City Sermon Cast. So the picture that we have of God influences everything about us. It influences what we value, how we live, how we view ourselves, how we view others. But what if the picture is incomplete? Or worse, what if it's distorted? So in one of his most beloved parables, the parable of the prodigal son, Jesus reveals a God who is very different from the one that many people imagine. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's dive in. So in Luke 15, we read that Jesus is hanging out with tax collectors and sinners, and that there was a group of people called the Pharisees who were grumbling about this and saying that, oh, Jesus is hanging out with it. He welcomes sinners and he eats with them. And this is kind of the starting place for one of Jesus's most famous parables, the parable of the prodigal son. In a lot of ways, this parable is directed towards these Pharisees who were grumbling about Jesus. And so it helps if we know a little something about them. So the Pharisees were adherents to the law of Moses. So they took all the rules from the Bible and they really tried to follow them as strictly as they could. But the Pharisees took it even a step further, and they built what some people call a hedge around the law. So if you can picture kind of like a hedge maybe that separates your yard from your neighbor's yard or separates a different part of a garden, they literally put in place laws that protect the laws. So, for example, one of the laws in the Old Testament is that we should do no work on the Sabbath day, right? So that's a rule. We could say, okay, don't work on the Sabbath day. But now we have to ask the question, but what is work, right? And who gets to define what work is? So the Pharisees were more than happy to jump in and define that for us and create layers upon layers upon layers, right? So, for example, the Pharisees back in the day would say, you can't build a fire because building a fire is work. Well, if you can't build a fire, then you probably can't cook your food. So if you want to eat on the Sabbath, you have to prepare your food the day before, right? But here's the thing. None of that was said in the Bible. Nobody said you can't make a fire and you can't cook food. All that God told Moses was don't work on the Sabbath. So you see this, you kind of get these layers upon layers upon layers of laws. And the truth is, a lot of Christian people do this today, too. They take the scriptures and they kind of think something is indicated there, and then they create rules upon rules upon rules. So, for example, many Christians would say that you can't be a Christian and drink alcohol. But here's what I'm going to say. So we need to be very cautious when we drink alcohol. And if you have any alcoholism in your family or tendency towards alcoholism, you need to be cautious. And many people should abstain from alcohol. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that you have, as a Christian, you can't drink, right? I grew up with kind of notions about, like, you know, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't dance or play cards. I got in trouble one time as a youth director because I did a children's sermon and I used a deck of cards, and literally some ladies in the church like fussed at me about it. You know what the Bible says about not dancing or playing cards? Not a single thing. It doesn't say anything about it. I also grew up for a time where people said, oh, if you're a Christian, you can't listen to secular music. You should only listen to religious music all the time. And again, you know what the Bible says about it? Not a thing. So the real problem with the Pharisees and the real problem with kind of people who want to make all of these rules is not necessarily the rules, which might be pointing us to, or maybe actually do point us towards some things that are good. The real issue is they didn't really understand the character and the heart of God, and they were focused on the wrong thing. So the first time that this really hit me when I was watching the TV show called The Chosen. Have you all seen that? It's kind of a modern day take on the life of Jesus. And one of the things I saw in this was a time that Jesus healed somebody in the show. Now, if you can imagine that, as I remember the scene, Jesus had gone up to somebody and the guy was blind, and Jesus went up to him and kind of touched his eyes, and suddenly he could see again, right? So what would you imagine the emotions of that situation would be like? If maybe imagine yourself as the blind person and somebody healed you, what would your emotion be? Or imagine if you were watching that happen, right? So you saw this guy who's been blind and suddenly somebody heals him. Like, what would you feel, right? So the producers of The Chosen do a great job, and the emotion that everybody experiences is joy. I mean, that's what you would expect, right? The man who is healed turns to Jesus and throws his arms around him and begins to weep. The disciples and the other bystanders, their faces are just filled with joy, right? But then there's these other people around the situation, the Pharisees and these kind of people who are really involved in like this legalism. And what's their response? Their response is they kind of get tight-lipped about it and they say, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't heal on the Sabbath. Well, you know what? The Bible doesn't say anywhere that you can't heal on the Sabbath. The Bible says you can't work on the Sabbath. Well, but if you're a healer, then that's working, right? And so do you see, this is where these layers upon layers upon layers come into play again. But what stood out to me in that scene when I watched it in The Chosen, and I was like, okay, wait, there's something wrong with those guys. Like, right? What's wrong with you if you can't rejoice when someone is healed? What's wrong with you if you can't rejoice when somebody is shown mercy or forgiveness? What's wrong with you that you're more focused on these made-up rules than you are about the real human experience that people are having around you? So Jesus' spending time with sinners and with tax collectors is because the sinners and the tax collectors were people who were hurting, and they needed God's presence and they needed God's guidance in their lives. They needed mercy. They needed to be restored in their relationship. And when Jesus did those things, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. But how do the Pharisees and the scribes respond? Because Jesus is hanging out with these people who need a little love and a little compassion and a little of God's presence. They grumble about it, Luke tells us, right? And again, we sometimes see this from Christian people today as well, right? Did you see what she was wearing? I mean, I've heard that in churches before. I had a preacher friend of mine came one time and kind of substitute preached for me, and he wore a polo shirt when he preached and didn't put on a tie. And somebody from the church actually wrote him a nasty letter. And I just remember thinking, really, like this is what we're focused on. A theologian named A.W. Tozer says, what a person thinks of when they think about God is the most important thing about them. And that might take, you may need to think about that for a little while. Like what we imagine and what we think about God, it just informs so much about who we are, about what we value, about how we view ourselves, about how we view others. And the Pharisees, I think, pictured God primarily as a divine rule maker, kind of like a cosmic referee who's up there kind of watching over people, watching for us to break the rules, going to blow a whistle, going to give us a yellow card. And this informed the way that they lived. It informed the way they treated others. By the way, I bet they were a ton of fun to hang out with, don't you think? Imagine what they were like on the inside. What was their own kind of inner dialogue like about themselves? So let me ask you this question. What do you think of when you think of God? What do you picture? Do you picture a harsh judge? Do you picture a distant, disapproving figure? Is God a mean old man in the sky? I'll never forget the time I was talking to a man whose wife had been diagnosed with cancer. And in his understanding of God and in thinking about the situation, he really believed that God had given his wife cancer because of some sin that he had committed in his life. So he expressed that to me, and then he said to me, now, I know that I'm supposed to love God, but I'm really struggling with that. And I thought to myself, no wonder you're struggling to love God. Like, how do you love a God who gives your wife cancer because of something that you did, right? But you see, again, so this image that we have of God informs so many things about us. So if the God that you imagine is harsh, is vindictive, is cruel, I want you to listen to this story that Jesus tells. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the wealth that will belong to me." So he divided his assets between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and he traveled to a distant region, and there he squandered his wealth in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that region, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that region, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he went off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran out and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on, and he replied, 'Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he's gotten him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never have given me even a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" So if you've heard this story before, we tend to make this story about the younger son. But Jesus, from the very beginning, tells us that there are 2 sons. And I think we really need to pay attention to both of them. So the younger son takes his father's inheritance and he goes off and basically wastes it partying. But eventually he comes to his senses. I like some of the translations say eventually he comes to himself. Like he just kind of has a moment where he realizes, what am I doing? And he decides to go home to his father. But in his mind, he actually says, I'm no longer worthy to be called a son of my father's son. So I'm just going to go back and I'm going to be a servant. And so the son begins to come home, and there's some beautiful moments in this story. One is that the father sees the son before he even gets there. Like the father's been watching and waiting for him. Another beautiful moment is the father runs out to the son to greet him. And this is when the son starts this little speech that he's been practicing. He says, "Oh, Father, I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father basically ignores this speech that the son gives, and he tells his servants, "Look, quick, go home, get a robe, put a ring on his finger, put sandals on his feet." The ring is really the thing that we ought to notice, because the ring was a sign of his sonship. And so this is the father saying, look, I know that you say you're no longer worthy to be called my son, but you are my son. And the father kind of acknowledges that. And then the father kills the fatted calf, and they have a great party, right? So that's the story. So the father welcomes this son back with open arms and with forgiveness and with love. So the other son in the story, the older son, is right where we would expect that he would be. He's out in the field. He's working. And this son is loyal to his father. He's dutiful. He's obedient. And when he hears that this party is going on, he gets mad at his father. And the father comes out to the son in the field, which again, I think is a beautiful moment there too. So think about it. The father that ran out to greet the younger son goes out to greet the older son as well. And the older son, I always kind of think maybe this is the first time that the older son has really told the dad what he thinks. He goes, look, I've done all this stuff for you. I've always done what you've asked me to. I've always obeyed the rules. But here your son comes and you're throwing this giant party for him, and he's unhappy about it. And the father, again, really says this kind of beautiful thing to the older son. He says to him, look, you've always been with me. We've always been together, and everything that I have is yours. And the father says, but this brother of yours came home, and we have to have a celebration, right? I love what Henry Nouwen says about the father and about these two sons. He says, the father shows the same grace to the son who is lost inside the home as he does to the son who is lost outside the home. So one son has distanced himself from the father by kind of breaking the rules. The other son is distancing himself from the father because he's like too focused on duty and obedience, and he's lost the sense of being in relationship with his father and loving his father. He's missed the point that he's already got on a robe, and he's already got on a ring, and he's already a part of the bounty of the father's household. He's lost sight of that. And one of the beautiful things about this story is that it really paints a picture of us, of who God is. And I really think this is what Jesus is trying to do. God is not a referee. God is not a punisher. God is a father who runs towards the hurting. God is a father who pleads with the resentful. God is a father who loves both the reckless and the rigid. That is who God is, right? And one of the things I want to make sure you know is that is who God is for you. If you find yourself far away from God and breaking all the rules, if you're feeling ashamed, if you're feeling guilty, if you're feeling broken, God is the kind of God who runs out to you. Or whether you're out in the field and you're bitter and you're angry and you're keeping score, that same God comes out to you and wants to welcome you into this party. Not because you've earned it, but because we have a loving Father and because we are God's child. So can you claim that for yourself? But I also want to make sure we know this is the same God that is for other people, right? Maybe the people that we look down on, maybe the ones that have hurt us, maybe the ones we write off, maybe the ones we whisper about. God is also for them, even for the people who haven't come to their senses yet. Now, I do want to say this. This does not mean that we should just, because of God's grace and love, do whatever we want to and hurt ourselves and hurt other people. I would suggest to you that the reason, however, that we live moral lives is not because there's some rules written someplace arbitrarily and because we're worried about being punished, but because when we're in right relationship with God and we're in right relationship with others, we don't want to hurt other people and we don't want to harm other people. And what rules do is they point us towards what is good. They point us towards what is life. So this is not like a license to go do whatever you want to, and then God's just going to welcome me back home. It's about being in right relationship with God, who is a Father who loves us. So if you've got if you think you might have some of these distorted images of God that I've talked about, I do want to recommend, there's a really great book that I found years ago, and I found it really helpful, called The Good and Beautiful God. And what the kind of subtitle of the book is it's Falling in Love with the God Jesus Knows. And part of what Jesus came to do is to help us to know God. And James Bryan Smith, who wrote this book, kind of takes us through different maybe misunderstandings that we have about God and helps us look at God through Jesus's eyes. And I do love the fact that, again, that subtitle is Falling in Love with the God Jesus Knows, because the more you come to know God the way that Jesus helps us understand God, I promise you, the more that you will fall in love with that God. So if you're struggling with God, if you'd like to know God more powerfully in your life, I'd ask you to consider this. Maybe the problem isn't God. Maybe the problem is what you think you know about God. And I would encourage you to try this. Fall in love with the God that Jesus knows. A God of grace, a God of joy, a God of patience, a God of generosity, a God of the underdog, a God of love. So let me ask you again, what do you think of when you think of God? Is it the God that Jesus knows? Is it the God that Jesus reveals? If it's not, maybe it's time to trade in that old picture. God is a God who comes to us, not with scolding, not with condemnation, but with open arms, with love, with a gentle invitation. Come inside and join the celebration. Catch you next time, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Mid-City Church Sermoncast. If you'd like to find a home sheet, a resource that accompanies the sermoncast that has more questions to explore, the scriptures we use today, and more information, you can visit our website, midcity.church/sermoncast. If you'd like to support Mid-City Church by giving, please text the word GIVE to 225-307-0662. Thank you for your generosity, and we look forward to seeing you next week.